This is Roy on the 94. We got company in the trees.
The Ossuran Combine had a rule for first contact, refined across 200 prior campaigns. Find the loneliest stretch of road on any world and start there. Their survey ships found 400 miles of two-lane highway cutting through Alaskan interior wilderness, traffic so sparse that entire hours passed without a single vehicle, and Fleet Overseer Dresk having called it the ideal soft landing, isolated, unwatched, and far from anything resembling organized response. What his survey never flagged was that the handful of vehicles using that highway were almost all long-haul trucks, driven by people who talked to each other constantly, watched out for each other by habit, and had absolutely nothing better to do at 3 in the morning than get very, very curious about something weird on their road. If you like watching an invasion get quietly run down by people who drive for a living and take strangers on their highway personally, smash that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me the longest stretch of nothing you've ever driven through. Let's get out on the Alaska highway, because somebody just picked the wrong lonely road. The road that lied. The Alaska highway does not look like much on a map, and it looks like even less from orbit. 400 miles of two-lane blacktop cutting through black spruce, forest, muskeg, and open tundra, connecting a handful of small towns separated by hours of driving in every direction, with traffic volume low enough that the Ossuran Combine survey team had genuinely struggled to find enough vehicle activity across a full week of monitoring to build a reliable traffic model. Fleet Overseer Dresk having took this as an unambiguous good sign. 200 prior campaigns had taught the Combine that population density and infrastructure density were the two variables that mattered most when selecting a landing zone, and this stretch of highway scored so low on both that his intelligence division had initially flagged the region as barely worth surveying in detail at all. Traffic volume across the target corridor averages under 15 vehicles per hour during peak daylight hours, his intelligence officer, a careful and unusually thorough Ossuran named Varen, reported during the final briefing. Overnight hours show significantly reduced volume, typically under 5 vehicles per hour. And the composition of that traffic. Varen checked the secondary data. Predominantly heavy freight vehicles, Overseer, long-haul commercial transport. Isolated operators, good, minimal coordination risk. Dresk marked the assessment complete and authorized the drop for the pre-dawn hours, when traffic volume would be at its lowest and any response, organized or otherwise, would be slowest to materialize. What his survey had entirely failed to capture, because it wasn't the kind of thing that showed up in traffic volume data, was that the handful of drivers running this highway at 3 in the morning were not, in any meaningful sense, isolated operators. They were part of a tight, constantly communicating community that had been talking to each other over CB radio, and more recently, a shared trucking app channel, for years sharing road conditions, warning each other about wildlife on the highway, checking in on anyone running solo through a stretch of road where a breakdown at the wrong hour could genuinely become a survival situation. 15 vehicles an hour looked like isolation from orbit. On the ground, it was a small, close-knit, endlessly chatty professional network that noticed absolutely everything unusual on their road within minutes of it happening. The first sighting. The landing craft came down at 2:50 in the morning, dropping into a wide clearing just off the highway's shoulder roughly 60 miles from the nearest town, chosen specifically for its distance from any settlement and its proximity to open ground suitable for a quiet, unobserved touchdown. It was seen, almost immediately, by a driver named Roy Castellano, 48 years old, 22 years running this exact stretch of highway hauling freight between Fairbanks and points further north, who had slowed his rig on a long straightaway specifically because he'd caught a strange orange glow through the trees off to his right, and had the kind of professional caution that came from 2 decades of learning to trust his gut about anything unusual on this road. He didn't stop. Stopping alone at night for something he couldn't identify was exactly the kind of decision that got solo drivers into serious trouble on a highway with response times measured in hours rather than minutes. Instead, he kept his speed steady, picked up his CB, and did the thing every driver on this road did automatically when something didn't look right. Breaker, breaker, anybody on this stretch tonight? This is Roy on the Fairbanks run, mile marker 180-something. Just saw something come down off the highway T. Hat wasn't a plane. Big, quiet, landed real soft in the clearing past the old logging turnoff. Anybody else got eyes on this? The response came fast, because at 3 in the morning on this particular stretch of highway, the handful of drivers running it were almost always listening, out of habit as much as necessity. This is Denise, running about 40 minutes behind you, Roy. I got a weird light on my dash cam feed too. Thought it was heat lightning at first, but there's no storm tonight. Marcus here coming up from the south, still a ways out. What's it look like, Roy? Like I said, quiet, big, landed soft. Didn't look like any wreck I've ever seen. No fire, no smoke, no distress beacon that I can tell. Roy eased off his throttle slightly, watching his mirrors, professional instinct telling him this was worth slowing down for but not worth stopping alone for. I'm gonna keep rolling till I hit cell signal, then I'll call it in properly. Anybody coming up behind me, keep an eye out, might be worth a look together once there's more than one of us. What Roy didn't know, and what the Ossuran landing team wouldn't understand for several more hours, was that this single CB exchange had just done more to compromise the mission's secrecy than any conventional detection system the Combine had prepared to counter. Within 20 minutes, 6 separate drivers across a 150-mile stretch of highway were aware of the sighting, cross-referencing it against their own dash cam footage and radar detector anomalies, and doing what truckers on a lonely highway had always done when something didn't add up, talking it through, sharing information, and quietly agreeing that somebody ought to get a closer look, together, rather than letting one driver handle something unusual alone. Fleet Overseer Dresk, Havin's first indication that his landing had already been observed, came nearly an hour later, when his perimeter sensors detected multiple vehicles converging on the clearing from both directions along the highway. Not the panicked, disorganized traffic pattern his models would have expected from a population that had stumbled onto something frightening, but a slow, deliberate convergence that looked, to his tactical analysis, disturbingly like coordinated reconnaissance. "Report," he said to Varen, "vehicle count and disposition. 4 heavy freight vehicles currently approaching the perimeter from 2 directions. Overseer. Speed is reduced from highway cruising speed, consistent with careful observation rather than transit. A 5th vehicle has stopped approximately 2 kilometers from the site and appears to be transmitting on a local communication frequency. They are coordinating." "It would appear so, Overseer, though I would note the nature of the transmission suggests information sharing rather than any formal command structure. It resembles," Varen paused, cross-referencing the translated audio against known human communication patterns. "Casual conversation between colleagues, Overseer, not military coordination." Dresk considered this the way a commander considers an anomaly that doesn't fit any prior category cleanly. Casual conversation, that is, nonetheless, converging 6 vehicles on our position within 90 minutes of first contact. "That does appear to be the practical effect, Overseer, yes." The pull-off. By 4:15 in the morning, 7 trucks had gathered at a wide gravel pull-off roughly half a mile from the clearing, engines idling, running lights cutting through the dark, in what had organically become the closest thing to an organized human presence the Ossuran landing force had encountered since touching down. Roy Castellano, whose original sighting had started the whole thing, found himself functioning as something between a coordinator and a very informal committee chair, mostly because he'd been the first one there and the others had, without much discussion, simply started deferring to whoever had eyes on a situation first. A habit built from years of a profession where sharing accurate, timely information was the difference between a smooth run and a serious problem. "All right," he said, standing at the pull-off with 5 other drivers gathered loosely around him, headlights from the parked rigs throwing long shadows across the gravel. "Anybody actually get eyes on it up close yet?" "I drove past on the highway side," said Denise Marchetti, 36, 6 years running this route after switching over from long haul in the lower 48. "Didn't stop, didn't want to be the only one sitting there if it turned out to be something dangerous. But I got a good look. It's not a plane, not a satellite piece, nothing I've ever seen come down before. Metal, dark, real symmetrical like it was built, not like it crashed." "Built," Marcus Reyes repeated, 41, running this highway for going on 15 years, long enough to have developed the specific weathered patience of someone who'd seen plenty of strange things on lonely roads and generally preferred to understand a situation fully before reacting to it. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "I'm thinking," Roy said slowly, "that whatever this is, it's not from around here, and it landed on our road in the middle of the night trying real hard not to be seen. And I don't love that combination." What none of them said, because none of them needed to, was the specific, shared understanding that came from years of driving this exact stretch of highway. This was their road. Not in any legal or territorial sense, but in the practical, everyday sense of a group of people who spent more hours on this particular stretch of asphalt than almost anyone else alive, who knew every turnoff, every weak spot in the shoulder, every stretch where cell coverage dropped and every stretch where it came back, and who had, over years of shared use, developed the specific proprietary instinct that comes from genuinely knowing a piece of ground better than almost anybody else who might pass through it. Something landing on that road, uninvited, trying to hide, was not a situation any of them were inclined to simply drive past. The following, what happened next, was not, by any stretch, an organized military response. It was something considerably stranger and considerably more effective. 7 long-haul trucks, running on a loose, constantly updated CB consensus, began systematically positioning themselves along every access point in and out of the clearing where the Ossuran craft had landed, not to attack it, but simply to watch it, parking at wide intervals along the highway shoulder and the old logging road that fed into the area, headlights angled to cover the maximum visible ground, engines left running for warmth and mobility, in a rough, improvised perimeter that none of them had consciously designed, but that emerged, almost automatically, from years of habit around watching out for hazards on a road where help was often hours away. "I got the north access covered," came a voice over the CB from a driver named Frank Delgado, who'd arrived an hour after the initial sighting and had immediately, without needing to be asked, positioned his rig at the one spot where the old logging road connected back to the highway. "Anything comes out this way, you'll hear about it." "South side's covered too," Denise confirmed, and Roy still got eyes on the main clearing from the pull-off. "Nobody's doing anything stupid, right?" Marcus said, a note of genuine caution in his voice. "We don't know what that thing can do. I'm not saying don't watch it, I'm saying let's not go poking at something none of us understand." "Nobody's poking anything," Roy said. "We're just watching. Same as we'd do if somebody's rig went off the road out here in the middle of nowhere and we weren't sure yet if they needed help or if the situation was more complicated than that. We watch, we share what we see, and we figure out what's actually going on before anybody does anything else." Fleet Overseer Dresk Having, monitoring this development from his command position with mounting and entirely unprecedented confusion, found himself facing a tactical situation his 200 prior campaigns had genuinely never prepared him for. A civilian population that had not fled, had not panicked, and had not attempted any kind of direct confrontation, but had instead simply and thoroughly surrounded his landing site with enough distributed, mobile, well-lit observation posts that any attempt to move ground forces in or out of the clearing, without being immediately seen, tracked, and reported across the entire local network had become, for all practical purposes, impossible. Varen, he said, assessment, are these vehicles armed? Scans detect no weapon systems, Overseer. The vehicles themselves are large and heavy, but configured for cargo transport, not combat. Then why do I feel surrounded? Varen considered the question with the specific care of an officer trying to translate an entirely unfamiliar tactical situation into terms his commander would find useful. Because we are, Overseer, not by force, by observation. Every route in or out of this location is currently within direct visual range of at least one of these vehicles, and their communication network appears to relay information across the entire group with a speed and reliability that exceeds most formal Combine field communication systems I have encountered. The first ground team. At 5:30 in the morning, with dawn still hours away in the Alaskan interior winter, Dresk authorized a small reconnaissance team to move out from the landing craft and assess the situation directly, on the theory that a face-to-face demonstration of Combine technology and authority would be sufficient to disperse what his tactical analysis still classified as an unarmed civilian gathering, regardless of how thoroughly it had positioned. D itself. The team of 4 soldiers in standard field armor emerged from the tree line near the main clearing and immediately found themselves illuminated by the combined headlights of 3 trucks parked at careful, overlapping angles specifically designed, though none of the drivers would have described it in those terms, to eliminate any approach to the clearing that wasn't fully visible from at least one vehicle. Roy Castellano, standing at the edge of the pull-off with a thermos of coffee and the specific calm of a man who had, over 22 years, developed a fairly high threshold for what qualified as an actual emergency, watched the 4 armored figures step into the light and did not immediately panic, run, or reach for anything resembling a weapon. He did what came naturally to him after 2 decades of professional experience with unusual, potentially dangerous situations on remote highways. He assessed, calmly, out loud, over the radio, so everyone else listening had the same information he did. All right, we got 4 of them coming out of the trees now. Armored, tall, moving slow and deliberate, not running at us, not raising anything that looks like a weapon, just walking out into the light like they want to be seen. You think they're trying to talk? Denise asked over the CB. Maybe, or maybe they're trying to figure out what we are, same as we're trying to figure out what they are. Roy set his coffee down on the hood of his truck and took a slow step forward, hands visible, deliberately unhurried, the same body language he'd use approaching a stranded motorist he wasn't sure about yet. Only one way to find out. The lead soldier's translator activated, working through several hours of overnight signal intercepts that had given it a rough, if imperfect, grasp of the local dialect. Human, you are gathered at the perimeter of a restricted operation. Disperse. Roy considered this for a moment. See, here's the thing, he said. This road's ours. Not legally, I know that. I'm not gonna pretend I've got some kind of deed to it. But we drive it, every one of us, more hours a week than most people spend awake. And when something lands on it in the middle of the night trying not to be seen, we're gonna want to know what it is before we just drive on past and pretend we didn't notice. So how about you tell us what you're actually doing out here, and maybe we can all figure out how to share the road. The soldier's translator flagged this response as, per its threat classification system, neither compliance nor aggression, a category it had not been extensively trained on. The supply run problem. By mid-morning, Dreskhaven's landing force faced a logistics problem that his 200 prior campaigns had never once required him to solve, because it had never once been relevant. His ground operation, intended as a brief, low-visibility staging point before a wider push into the region, was now under constant, thorough, well-lit observation from a rotating cast of trucks that showed no sign of losing interest, running out of patience, or leaving the area, and his own supply situation, calculated for a short, quiet reconnaissance mission rather than an extended standoff, was beginning to strain under a timeline nobody had planned for. Overseer, his logistics officer reported, current consumables will sustain the ground team for approximately 18 more hours at standard consumption rates. I would also note that our attempts to establish a secondary supply drop have been complicated by the fact that any craft approaching this location will be immediately visible to the observation network currently surrounding us. Dresk considered this with the specific, mounting frustration of a commander watching a routine operation slowly transform into something he had no established doctrine for handling. They are simply watching, indefinitely. It would appear so, Overseer. I would add that additional vehicles have continued to arrive throughout the morning. Current count stands at 11, with radio traffic suggesting at least 4 more are en route from further down the highway. What Dresk did not yet fully understand, because his intelligence assessment had never accounted for it, was that this specific stretch of highway operated on a professional culture where checking in on an unusual situation, staying informed, and lending a hand or an extra set of eyes to a colleague dealing with something out of the ordinary was simply standard practice. The same instinct that had, for years, meant a driver with engine trouble at 3 in the morning rarely waited long before someone else on the road stopped to help, regardless of whether they knew each other personally. An alien landing was, by any measure, considerably more unusual than a breakdown, but the underlying professional habit, check in, share information, don't leave a fellow driver to handle something alone, applied just as readily. Send a formal communication, Dresk said finally, arriving at a decision 200 prior campaigns had never once required of him. Direct contact. I want to understand what would actually convince this population to disperse, because our current approach is clearly not achieving it. The conversation at the pull-off. Dresk having himself, accompanied by Varen and a small honor escort, walked out to the highway pull-off at just past noon, a decision that would have been considered an extraordinary breach of standard Combine protocol on any of the 200 worlds his career had previously touched, made now out of a specific, growing recognition that no conventional tactic available to him was producing any meaningful result against a population that simply would not stop watching, would not disperse, and would not, apparently, be intimidated by anything short of a level of force he had no authorization or genuine desire to use against unarmed civilians. Roy Castellano met him at the edge of the gravel, flanked loosely by Denise, Marcus, and 4 other drivers who had, over the course of the morning, settled into an easy, watchful presence that had never once required anyone to formally organize it. "You'll be in charge," Roy said. It wasn't really a question. Fleet Overseer Dresk said, his translator now considerably smoother after nearly 10 hours of continuous exposure to local dialect. "Of the Ossuran Combine." Roy Castellano, "I drive freight between Fairbanks and the border crossing mostly, have for 22 years. He gestured loosely at the gathered trucks, engines still idling behind them. "These folks mostly do the same give or take." "You have surrounded my operation for nearly 10 hours, Dresk said. "Without weapons, without any formal authority, and without, as far as my analysis can determine, any coordinated command structure directing your actions." "That's about right," Roy said. "We don't really have a boss out here telling us what to do about something like this. We just talk to each other, share what we're seeing, and generally look out for whoever's on the road with us. Been doing it for years, long before you folks showed up. This just happened to be a bigger version of the same thing." Dresk considered this, looking past Roy at the loose, informal gathering of trucks and drivers that had, without any centralized planning, effectively neutralized his entire operation's ability to move, resupply, or maintain the secrecy his mission had depended on. "What would it take," he said slowly, "for you to allow us to depart peacefully?" Roy thought about this seriously, the way a man thinks about a question he genuinely hadn't expected to be asked. "Honestly, just tell us what you actually wanted out here. Because right now all we know is something landed on our road in the middle of the night trying not to be seen. And in my experience, folks who aren't doing anything wrong don't usually go to that much trouble to avoid being noticed." The answer, what followed, was, by Combine standards, an almost unthinkable breach of operational security. Fleet Overseer Dresk having, faced with a situation his doctrine had no answer for, explained haltingly at first, and then with increasing, almost relieved candor, that the Ossuran Combine had intended this landing as a quiet first assessment of the region, a preliminary step toward a larger operation that depended entirely on remaining undetected for as long as possible, and that the total, thorough failure of that plan within the first few hours had left him with no remaining strategic options that didn't involve either a level of violence against unarmed civilians he had no stomach for, or a withdrawal he had never once had to consider in 200 prior campaigns. "We came here to conquer," he said finally, standing in the cold Alaskan noon with a mug of coffee someone had handed him without much ceremony partway through the conversation. Quietly, efficiently, before anyone had the chance to organize against us. "I do not know what to do with a population that organized against us within the first hour, using nothing but conversation and parked vehicles." Roy considered this with the specific, unhurried patience that had gotten him through 22 years of remote highway driving, hard winters, and more strange, unplanned situations than he could easily count. "Yeah, well, out here, that's mostly all we've got. No cavalry's coming to help us on this road most nights. Nearest real backup is hours away, easy. So we look out for each other, we pay attention to what's happening around us, and when something doesn't add up, we don't just drive on by and hope it sorts itself out. Comes in pretty handy, turns out, even against something like this." "You are not soldiers." "No," Roy agreed. "We're truckers. But I'll tell you what 22 years on this road teaches you if you're paying attention. Pretty much anybody can handle an emergency if they've had enough practice not panicking about the small ones first." The withdrawal. Dresk Haven's final report to Combine High Command, filed from orbit later that afternoon after a withdrawal that had been, by any measure, the strangest conclusion to a landing operation in his entire 200 campaign career, took considerably longer to compose than any prior after-action summary he had submitted. "Marshal," Varen said, reviewing the draft alongside him, "how would you classify the resistance encountered?" Dresk considered the question for a long moment, thinking back over 10 hours that had begun with a routine, low-risk landing, and ended with a full strategic withdrawal, achieved entirely through unarmed observation, patient conversation, and a network of civilian communication that had proven more resilient, more responsive, and more thoroughly effective than most formal Combine intelligence systems he had worked with across 200 worlds. "I would classify it," he said finally, "as the most effective resistance this division has ever encountered, achieved by a population that never once considered themselves to be resisting anything. They were simply doing what they always do when something unusual happens on their road. It happened to be more than sufficient." Epilogue. The Ossuran transports lifted off from the clearing just before sunset, climbing into a sky already deepening toward the long Alaskan winter dusk, watched by a small crowd of drivers who had, over the course of one very long day, gone from cautious observers to something considerably closer to reluctant hosts, standing at the edge of the highway with coffee thermoses and the specific, quiet satisfaction of people who had handled an unprecedented situation the same practical way they handled everything else out here, together, without much fuss, and without anyone ever needing to be formally put in charge. Roy Castellano finished his delivery run 2 days late, which his dispatcher accepted with considerably more understanding than usual once the full story made its way through the company, and told the tale at every truck stop between Fairbanks and the border crossing for years afterward, usually ending it the same way. "They picked this road because it looked empty," he'd say. 15 trucks an hour tops in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. What they didn't figure is that every single one of those trucks talks to every other one all the time about everything. Ain't a lonely road out there if you're paying attention. It's just a quiet one until it isn't. Denise Marchetti kept a printout of her dash cam footage from that night taped inside her cab for years, more as a conversation starter with curious passengers than out of any real need to prove the story. And Marcus Reyes, for his part, simply started referring to that stretch of highway as the interesting mile marker for the rest of his career, a phrase that meant nothing to anyone outside the small, tight community of drivers who'd been there, and instantly identified anyone who understood it as someone who'd earned the right to hear the full story. The Combine's official record of the incident, filed deep in archives that would be studied for generations afterward as a cautionary example in underestimating civilian populations, concluded with a line that would eventually circulate, with some irony, among officers preparing for future first contact assessments across the Combine's remaining unexplored territories. This world's remote transportation corridors must not be assessed as isolated simply because vehicle density is low. The population using these corridors maintains constant, informal, highly effective communication networks that respond to anomalies with a speed and thoroughness exceeding many formal Combine intelligence structures. Recommend all future survey assessments treat low traffic volume as a communication risk rather than an operational advantage. Note, local population does not appear to consider their response unusual or noteworthy. Multiple individuals characterized the entire incident, when interviewed, as simply keeping an eye on things, a phrase our translators have flagged as functionally equivalent to standard Combine reconnaissance doctrine, delivered with considerably less ceremony. Somewhere along that stretch of the Alaska Highway, the old logging turnoff where the Ossuran craft first touched down remains, to this day, an unremarkable gravel road that most drivers pass without a second thought, except for a small, informal group who know exactly what happened there one long winter night, and who still, out of habit as much as anything else, slow down just slightly whenever they pass it. The same way you'd slow down passing any stretch of road where something worth remembering once happened. If you enjoyed watching an alien invasion get quietly outorganized by a bunch of truckers who just wouldn't stop paying attention, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me the most unexpected thing you've ever seen on a long drive. Thanks for riding along. I'll see you in the next one.